So there are no real battles in kind of Google English, or no real fighting, but there's real fighting in the game of our next topic speaker, and I think those fights are really, really hard, and I'm really looking forward to the next speaker. His name is Benjamin Anders, and he is game designer at Deck 13, a German games company, and actually in a couple of days, they will release this game, AAA title. Everyone in the world is hoping for that title to be the hope in the AAA genre. So it's a really hardcore game, and it's a really hardcore RPG, so you have to fight lots of demons and lots of big bosses. And Benjamin Anders, he is the guy behind all boss fights. So give it a clap, and I'm really looking forward to this. Benjamin, teach us about boss fights, please.
So yeah, thanks Woody for the introduction. And okay, so here it works. So yeah, my name is Benjamin Anders. I'm a game designer for Deck 13 Interactive, and we are a Frankfurt-based game developer. And some of you may know our previous games like Ankh or Jack Keen, or maybe even Venetica, which was also the first role-playing game from Deck 13. And yeah, my topic today is, as well as you can see, the design of a video game boss enemy. And for that, I have brought with me today the first boss of Lords of the Fallen. But before we go too deep into detail, some of you may be wondering what actually is a video game boss. So I found this nice little description. A video game boss is a large progression and acts as the climax ending to the game's environment, level, or world. From Scott Rogers. So during my studies at college, I found this description in a book called Level Up, A Guide to Great Video Game Design, and everyone should read it, at least the game design students here. And this description is pretty accurate, but it didn't satisfy my need for detail in this case, so I came up with a concept which I call mockingly the Holy Trinity Force of boss fights. And yeah, this Trinity Force contains of three major elements. This is a climax, the story, and an exam. So first of all, I want to talk to you about the climax. As Roger said, boss fights should be the climax of a level or a level section. Story, action, and difficulty should be oriented so that they find their peak in boss fights. A good example for that is a nowadays called old school game Super Mario 3 for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Super Mario managed to make the almost perfect pacing in the game by raising the difficulty and action at the end of every level and finding their peak in the boss fight, just to drop slightly after that and raise higher in the next level until you finally rescue the princess, of course. Tools to achieve such climatic action are things like cinematic intro cutscenes, which you see often in AAA environments, or environmental storytelling, where you can see signs of the boss during the level, and it gets more detailed the further you get. Now let's talk a bit about storytelling. So to not involve boss fights in the story of a game is a great missed opportunity, and at least in my eyes, kind of a design flaw. It's the chance of the game to define a mighty antagonist who wants to take over the world. Or maybe this guy has just had a bad childhood, and it's actually not that bad at all. You often see bosses reappear in sequels of games, and you see them develop over different games, and you see them change, and you kind of get familiar with them. Or sometimes you get prequels where you actually see, hey, this guy wasn't so bad before. Maybe you meet him as a little child. And yeah, basically, you can tell what's behind this bad guy. This is not just a sword-singing, slaying asshole who wants to try to kill you. And yeah, now we get to the last point. That's an exam. And you may not believe it, but boss fights are pretty similar to your finals at college or your last test. Just much, much more fun. At least I hope so in most games. The player or the student has to prove that he has learned everything that the past level or semester has told him. If he successfully applies that knowledge at the boss fight, he passes to the next level. So theoretically, in the ideal scenario, all three of these aspects serve a boss fight in unison. But in reality, that actually rarely happens, and it doesn't have to. It always depends on what time of game you're developing for. So there are games that are not that story-driven, and they're more about the experience of combat and of fighting. And in some games, you meet bosses where you have seen that all before. It's no real test for the player because he has proven before that he's able to make this mechanic. But maybe the boss is very important for the story. So it shifts from game to game, and it always depends on what scope you're developing and what your game's orientation is. So now that we talked about the series, let me tell you a bit about Lords of the Fallen, so you get some round data about it. Some quick information about the game. Lords of the Fallen is a next-gen RPG, or let's say current-gen, because PS4 is out there already on Xbox. And it heavily focuses on tactical combat like rolling, dodging, and blocking. Some of you guys here played Dark Souls? Anyone? Yeah, okay, so it's kind of a Dark Souls-ish game, but it's not as hard as Dark Souls or not as punishing as Dark Souls. In such a tactical game, it's all about hand-to-hand fighting and having one-on-ones, so it's not surprising that boss fights play a big role in this game. Another thing I want to introduce to you is a bit about the story of Lords of the Fallen. The game takes place in a medieval fantasy setting, and the main character is called Haken, who is a convicted criminal and who was sentenced to serve the authorities as a fighter to redeem himself in the eyes of society. So he's not exactly a shining hero. 8,000 years ago, an invasion of a demon army, the so-called Roga, was successfully defended by humanity and its heroes. Rumors have spread that this army is about to return, and Haken was sent to investigate this. And now let's see at the guy who I've actually brought with me today. This is him, the first Warden. And I want to exemplify this Trinity Force of boss fights at the first Warden. So first of all, let's look at the climax. When the player firstly enters the game, he basically fights himself through a tutorial area where he gets to know and learn the basic combats and controls of the game. During this tutorial area, the player mostly fights weak enemies, so there isn't really much pressure and tension until he goes through that big wooden door, which you can see in the movie now, at least I hope. Yeah. So, yeah, I hope that's pretty climactic for the player. And, well, after he gets smashed by the first Warden in the face, the player knows that shit is about to go down, and he now has to really prove himself and prove that he has learned his mechanics. The next thing I want to tell you is how we involved the first Warden in the story. Beforehand, the player gets told by his mentor, Caslo, that the Roga army is led by powerful lords. But he doesn't exactly know much about the lords, just that it needs much energy to bring them into the human realm. So now Haken, or the player, sees for the first time how these lords are brought here and know what challenge lies ahead of him to diminish all these lords and ban them from the human realm. And that's what he does by closing these portals. And now to the last part, the exam. So as I said already, this is the real test of the player. He has to really show that he understands these basic mechanics of dodging, rolling, and blocking, and they are far more lethal than the first enemies he meets in the tutorial area. The boss is kind of designed to mirror the player at the beginning. We just saw a rogue character, but normally you can start out as a knight as well. And so don't be too extravagant, then the player doesn't get overwhelmed by new limbs the boss has and can hit him from all angles. So just to see and test his basic combat, because the player is obviously still a lot to learn. Okay, now that we looked over the concept of the first Warden and how it's implemented, I want to show you some of the specific tools and design patterns we use to create attacks in the first Warden, especially in the combat design where most of my work took place. So, as a designer, you often get input from coworkers, from other departments, from art, from programmers, on how cool things could be done, or how awesome we could make them. And that's pretty nice, and it's always helpful, but sometimes these ideas are just over the top, and they are unrealistically unfair to the player, and they would definitely not benefit the game experience. So yeah, the game takes place in a fictive fantasy setting, and we could possibly make his weapon 10 times the size of the player, so it will feel truly epic, which is, by the way, a word which is often used in game development. Something has to be epic, but no one knows what epic actually means. And yeah, but that's not the case. So our job as designers is to fit those crazy ideas, which often enough come from ourselves, into a playable system. And there are some rules and restrictions to that. So a pretty smart man called Eric Williams is also a well-known game designer who worked on things like God of War 1 and 2, published an article about video game combat and fighting experience. Based on that article, we developed a slightly modified system that is perfectly usable to design attacks in Lords of the Fallen. Now let's take a look how we designed these attack patterns. Okay, there's my awesome PowerPoint skills. One very important aspect of combat design is hit feedback. And this goes both ways. For example, if the player hits an enemy, he really needs to feel that, whoa, I actually hit this guy. And at the same way, if he gets smashed away like you've seen in the intro video, he totally should feel that. And that goes through rumble controller, camera shake, sound, and actually animation also. In hand-to-hand combat, it's everything about action and reaction. And one of the things that will happen quite frequently is that you remove the player's ability to react if you design the attack patterns of the enemy too powerful or too fast. And that's what brings us to importance of animation timing. So for every attack a boss performs, the player needs time to react. A good rule of thumb here is that the more powerful the attack is, the more time the player gets to react. So charge time is equivalent of the player's reaction time. What follows next are the hit frames. These are the exact frames where the attack of the boss will deal damage. If the player gets hit during these frames, he will start to play a hit reaction animation and will be unable to move. After the hit frame, the boss needs time to recover and get back into striking position. This recovery time is extremely important, because without it, the player would suffer a huge disadvantage, and the boss could just start charging his next attack, and the player would have no reaction time. And this is one of the main reasons to use this system. You can easily avoid a deadlock on a player and really increase the gameplay experience. Another reason to use this thing is if you design attacks, you work a lot together with animators, and they often have a pretty good idea of what they want to do. But if you don't give them something like this, they will design attacks, and you often have to iterate them over and over again. So this is another thing to shorten the iterative process of game design. So let's look at the other outcome. So the player sees his attack, sees the charge, and actually reacts in time and manages to avoid the hit frames. So the important thing here is the dodge recovery or the block recovery has to be lower than the actually hit recovery. So when the player successfully dodges an attack, he has time to retaliate and do actually damage to the boss and find an opening. I've brought with me a small clip so we can actually see the fight and what this means in the game and how it's played out in the end. Okay, now we first see a shield bash of the boss. And you can actually see he starts charging, the player sees it, avoids it, and now he has time to strike back and actually do some damage to the boss. So the dodging recovery was way shorter than what you will see next. So now he gets hit, and actually he has no chance to do anything. He just gonna stand there and hopefully get up to the next attack. Now you see one of the most powerful attacks of the first one. And if you want to play the game, you probably shouldn't listen because I'm going to tell you how to avoid this easily. He's charging real long. It's a real powerful attack. And it's actually pretty easy to sidestep or side roll. But you can play the clip. But now he gets hit first time. And if you get hit, you're going to get thrown way back. The other thing is that this attack is so powerful, it takes a long time for the boss to recover. So even when you get hit and you fly way back, you still have enough time to get back on your feet. But on the other hand, if you actually dodge the attack, you will have a lot of time to get into the boss's face and actually deal some damage. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. So these are the two primary examples. There are way more different steps than just getting knockback or dodging an attack by rolling. You have things like what we call is block breach. There are attacks, they are powerful, and if the player tries to block them with the shield, he gets block breach, so his shield just gets thrown back, but he's not completely knocked off. And there are other things where he might just stagger a bit backwards and have still enough time to retaliate this attack. But here's the thing we play with, we play with the player. The player tends to greed a lot. Often when I see playtesters playing the first Warden, they just want to get in one more attack. I just want to make one more strike and actually, so I can hit him one more time. And that greed is what often gets them killed. Animation timing and reaction type are the tools to tingle with the player's greed and often make boss fights harder than they actually are if you're disciplined enough. Yeah, I missed one slide, never mind. So yeah, this sums up my presentation for today. And under the friendly eyes of our fellow Haken here, I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any or if we have time. Thank you, and I hope I could give you a glimpse into the world of boss and enemy design.
Thank you, Benjamin. All right. So actually, a lot of people here played Dark Souls. I think this is a quite hard task to kind of build the bosses. And this is more like for AAA gamers, actually. So good luck. Are there any questions from you guys? There's a question.
So I'm just wondering, you just said epic, and the bosses have to be epic.
Yeah.
But if the first boss is already epic, so what's the second boss?
More
is it like double epic?
Yeah.
So how do you stage this epicness? I mean, how do you hold back the epicness that you actually already want to put in the first boss? And you know, how do you go up? Because if the first one, that looked pretty epic to me. I mean, so I'm wondering how is the 20th final boss?
Yeah.
I mean, is he does he have more spikes, or is he even bigger? Or is he as big as a whole planet? Or how do you scale that up?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. So that's what I meant when I said this word epic really bugs me sometimes because you can't really describe it. But how do you go up? Basically, you go up by making the bosses more complex. I mean, you see that guy was pretty simple. He had a sword and a shield, and he was basically just fighting. There was no magic involved, and there was no stuff like this. And the way you go up is actually not wrong. You go up by size. You start to scale bosses bigger, and you start to, maybe the next boss fight, you don't meet one boss, but there are two at a time. And maybe they can use magic, and then you get some things like environment you can interact with like you say you have a fire boss and there are water pools on the floor and stuff. You have to lure the fire boss into the water pools, and then you get lots of particles, and yeah, that's the scale on what goes up in epic.
But is it sometimes difficult for you because you come up with like this huge, great idea for a boss, but then you think, okay, no, I have to actually make him less epic because he's too early in the game?
Yeah, sometimes, but you can always try and shift those ideas into the later of the game. And yeah, you sometimes have to contain yourself, but because, you know, I saw playtesters going to the boss and dying like 48 times. And you still have to make people think, okay, this game is actually playable and I'm just not here for dying. Yeah, so you sometimes have to scale back and contain yourself so that you don't get overwhelmed with everything.
Thanks.
2 other questions.
Okay, so in a lot of games, boss fights are kind of like mini games of their own. What do you think is the better direction to go? To introduce new mechanic to make the boss stand out and make it more epic? Or to, like you mentioned before, go back to mechanics that you already established in the game and make them a challenge within that mechanic?
Okay, so what is better? Why things? Okay, so this also always depends on what type of game you're playing. So right now I just shown you stuff with this animation timing. And for example, if you go on games like World of Warcraft, there's not so much as rolling or dodging because these attacks are just straightforward and will always hit you and I can't avoid that. But I think it's mostly better to introduce new mechanics until to a certain level where you think, okay, now my game is well-rounded. The player has a lot of tools, and now I can play with their tools. I can make him think, so what could I use to defeat this boss? So what could I use, like, for example, I have the rolling, or I have shield bash, and this is already introduced by another boss, but how can I combine these attacks? Or how can I use these attacks in a creative way to defeat the next boss? I think in the end game kind of level, this is the best way to approach boss fights.
Okay, maybe one last question over there.
Hi. Hi. Okay. Hi. Thanks for a great presentation. And but I have the question of how do you actually make a boss harder? Because just juggling with numbers is, like make everything one hit you isn't like the right approach to just make it harder because it just feels unfair in this moment. So how do you actually make a boss harder? Do you just shorten the reaction times or something?
Okay, there are 2 approaches to that. There are one, like you said, just putting up the numbers, giving him more damage, more health, but that is more kind of a cheap way because it actually doesn't increase the difficulty, it just increases the time you need to take the boss down. And so yeah, you actually tingle with the attacks itself, like what I showed, the timing windows. You actually can shorten down charge time and reaction times for the player. But also you can, if you see a boss is too easy, you gotta maybe think about new features or how you can combine the existing features in the way that it's more challenging for the player. So it's not just about numbers, because if you tried it once and you see it just will frustrate the player because it would take him more time. Actually, something which challenged the creativity in the player to defeat the boss.
Okay, so thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And maybe you should cooperate with Anne and Google Ingress. Yeah. So Devra was cool, but just imagine you have to fight the first Warden in Bad Oeynhausen that would be cool, actually.